Hello everyone. In this lesson, we will learn how to set up a global header and footer. If you don't know what I'm referring to, let me show you. So here's the home page that we set up in our previous lesson. And on most websites, you're going to want some sort of header area that appears on every page of the website. Same thing with the footer area. So if you want to add content at the very top and bottom of your pages, your first instinct might be to go into your index.php file in your theme folder and just add something up at the very top. So even before the opening PHP tag, you could include an HTML headline that says, "This is the header area." And for the footer, down at the very bottom, after the closing PHP tag, we could say, HTML paragraph, "This is the footer area." And if I save this and refresh the home page, cool, we have a header and a footer. So that works, but it's not ideal because we want this same identical header on every single page of the site. But we know from last lesson that index.php doesn't power every page on our website. So for example, if we click on one of the blog posts, we lose our header and footer because this screen is powered by single.php. And don't forget about page.php, which powers individual pages instead of posts. So long story short, if we wanted this header and footer on every page, we would have to duplicate or copy and paste this code into multiple different template files. Now, duplicating code like that is almost always a bad practice because then if in the future, maybe a week from now, we want to change something in the header, we don't want to have to make that change in 5 or 10 or 20 different template files. Instead, we want our header code to live in just one file, right? We want a single source of truth. So check this out. Right now, I want you to create a new file in your theme folder. So new file, and let's name this new file header.php. And in this new file, let's write out a bit of dummy text. So maybe an HTML headline that says, "Greetings from header.php." All right, let's save this and then jump back into index.php. And let's delete this headline that we set up a couple of minutes ago. And instead, let's write a bit of code that will pull in the contents of header.php. So let's enter into PHP mode and then call a WordPress function named get_header. And remember, to call a function, you include parentheses right after it, semicolon. And we could close out of PHP here, but because we are just going to drop right back into PHP for all of this code, why don't we just get rid of this closing tag and also get rid of this opening tag? So that way we just stay in PHP mode. Anyways, back to the task at hand, this getHeader function will pull in the contents of header.php. So if we save this and refresh the home page, cool, we see greetings from header.php. Next, let's do the same thing for our footer. So back in our text editor, let's create a new file in the theme folder. Let's name this new file footer.php. In this file, let's write out a bit of dummy text. So maybe a paragraph that says, "Greetings from footer.php." Save this, and then back in our homepage index.php file, let's replace this down here with code that will dynamically pull in the contents of the footer file. So we could drop into PHP mode down here, or we could just write this code up here while we are still in PHP. You can probably guess the name of the WordPress function we want to use, get_footer. Okay, with that in place, if we save, cool, greetings from footer.php. And if we click on one of the blog post links, we do not see the header or footer, but all we need to do is go into single.php and call those getHeader and getFooter functions. So back in the text editor, let's jump into our single.php file. And right before the while loop, let's say get header All right, and then right after the curly bracket that closes the while loop, let's say get footer. Let's save that. And now our single post screen is in business. So that takes care of individual posts. Let's not forget about individual pages. Remember in our WordPress admin dashboard, if we click on pages in the sidebar, in our previous lesson, we created this dummy page, test page 123. And if I use this view link here to preview it, this screen is powered by page.php. So let's go ahead and jump into our text editor and hop into page.php. And let's pull in our global header and footer. So get header, and down here below the curly bracket, get footer. Cool. So now whenever we update header.php or footer.php, we can rest assured that our entire website globally will be updated. Now before we bring this lesson to a close, I have 2 more tasks for us that are directly related to the header and footer. First, let's learn how to load our CSS file on the front end of our website. And secondly, let's learn how to add the black admin menu bar that's supposed to sit at the top of our website globally. You can see the menu bar I'm referring to if you jump over to the WordPress admin screens, but that bar should also be on the front end of our website while we are signed in. Okay, but let's start with our first task of actually loading our CSS file on the front end of our website. If you've worked with HTML in the past, you probably already know how to load a CSS file, right? You include it towards the top of your HTML file in the head section. So to get started, let's jump into our text editor and open header.php, and let's delete this dummy text and start fresh. Let's begin with the basic skeleton of an HTML document. Right, so you always begin with the doc type, and then right below that you create an HTML sandwich, and then within that you have 2 sandwiches, the head sandwich and the body sandwich. So within the body section is where you include your actual content, right? So maybe you'd have a headline that says fictional university. All right, but back to the task at hand. The head section is usually where you load your CSS file. Only in WordPress, instead of manually including our CSS file using link, instead of doing that, in WordPress we just call a PHP function named wp_head. And this lets WordPress be in control of our head section. So imagine down the road we install a few WordPress plugins, and maybe those plugins need to load CSS files of their own. So this function lets WordPress have the final say and load whatever it needs to load in our head. All right, now with this line of code in place, all we need to do is programmatically tell WordPress to load our CSS file. And the way that we do that is by creating a brand new file in our theme folder. And let's name this new file functions.php. Now this new functions file is a bit different from all of the other files we've been creating so far. All of our other files are what we might call template files, right? They control the HTML that the general public will see on our website. Well, think of this functions.php file as a bit more private. This is our behind the scenes file. This is where we can have a conversation with the WordPress system itself. All right, but back to the task at hand. We want to tell WordPress to load our CSS file. So within this functions.php file, let's open up PHP and then call a WordPress function named add_action. This is a super useful WordPress function that we will use again and again throughout the course. Within these parentheses, this function wants us to give it 2 arguments. So for example, quotes and then A quotes B. Now obviously we're not going to pass it an argument of A and B. I'm just including these as placeholders, okay? Now let me explain what this function actually does. So WordPress lets us give it instructions and tell it what to do by using this add action function. The first argument is where we tell WordPress what type of instructions we are giving it. Depending on what we are trying to do, WordPress will run this code at different times. In this case, we want to load a file. So the special WordPress hook name that we want to hook onto is wp underscore onQ underscore scripts. Okay, and the name here definitely matters. You need to spell it exactly right or WordPress won't know what you're trying to do. All right, so this is our way of saying, hey WordPress, I want to load some CSS or JavaScript files. And then this second argument, instead of b, let's delete that. And what we do here is give WordPress the name of a function that we want to run. And it's important to point out that this is going to be a function that we create and define in about 10 seconds from now. So in this case, we need to make up a name. Why don't we name our function fictional university resources or fictional university files? How about university underscore files? Okay, for this argument, the name doesn't matter. It just needs to be something that makes sense to you personally and that you can remember. All right, now right above this line, why don't we create a function with this exact name? So we will say function, and then spell out that name, university underscore files, parentheses, and then we are defining or creating the function, so then curly brackets. And now within these curly brackets, within the body of this function, we can load as many CSS or JavaScript files as we want. For now though, we just want to load one CSS file, right? Our main style.css. So we will call a WordPress function named wp underscore onQ style. And within the parentheses, this function is looking for two arguments. For the first, we just need to make up a nickname for our main style sheet. This name does not matter. It just needs to make sense to us. Why don't we call it University Main Styles? Okay, and then the second argument is just a location that points towards the file. Later on in this course, we will learn how to point towards custom folder directories and look up specific file names. But in this case, since we just want to work with the main style.css file, and that's sort of the default style sheet in WordPress, we don't need to manually spell out a location here. We can just call a WordPress function named get underscore style sheet underscore URI. Okay, and that's a WordPress function that we are calling, so include parentheses right after it. Cool. And if we wanted to include a second or third CSS file, you could just duplicate this line here. And if you wanted to load a JavaScript file instead of CSS, you would just change this word from style to script. Singular script, not plural scripts. But I wouldn't worry about that because I will show you how to load a JavaScript file very soon. Okay, but for now, if we go ahead and save this file, and let's also be sure to save the recent changes to header.php, and then if we refresh in the browser, cool, we see that all of the text is orange. And that's because in our style.css file, remember we wrote this as a test in an earlier lesson. So if I change orange to green, you get the idea. Our CSS file is loading. Now before we move on to our final task for this lesson, which is loading the black admin menu bar up at the top here, before we get to that, I want to take a minute to review all of that code we just wrote in our functions.php file, because this can definitely feel confusing or overwhelming. So let's break it down. Really, all we did was create or define a brand new function that we chose the name of. We got to make this name up. The name doesn't matter. Within that function, we called a WordPress function and pointed towards the CSS file that we wanted to load. Okay, but remember that when you create and define a function, the function doesn't actually run. Someone or something needs to call that function later on. And that's exactly what we are doing in this line of code. WordPress has a function named addAction, and you give it two arguments. Let's begin with the second argument. This is just the name of a function that you want WordPress to call at a specific moment, and this is how you say which moment that should be. So WordPress has tons of different hooks or moments that we can hook onto. So altogether, this line of code is basically saying, hey, WordPress, right before you get ready to output your code that's going to go in the header, that's going to go in this WP head area, right before you're getting ready to output that, we want to tack onto that moment and we want you to run our custom function. Now, before we move on, I want to go over one last topic that is a common point of confusion for people. You might be thinking, hey, I thought whenever we call or run a function, we have to put parentheses right after it, right? We did that here, and we've been doing that throughout all of our template files. So why don't we include parentheses after this name here, right? If we want to call this function, why don't we add parentheses here? Well, we don't add the parentheses because we don't want to literally call this function right now, which means instead of you and I immediately calling the function right here and now, what we're doing is just telling WordPress, hey, here's the name of the function. It's up to you, WordPress, to actually run it at the precisely right moment. Okay, now let's move on to our final task of adding the black admin bar up at the top here. So to begin, let's jump into header.php. And what I want to do is move the closing body and closing HTML tags out of this file and into footer.php. If that doesn't make sense to you right now, that's okay. Just follow along with me. So delete the closing HTML and delete the closing body tag. All right, let's save this and then jump into maybe index.php just for a frame of reference. From a bird's eye view, how is our page getting created? So first we include our header.php, then we output the main content, meat and potatoes of the page, and then we have footer.php. So back to header, we don't want to close out the body and HTML sandwiches within this file. We want to do that at the very end of the HTML that gets generated. So over in footer.php, underneath our dummy text, let's close out the body tag and close out the HTML tag. And now, here's the important part. Right before the closing body tag, I want you to drop into PHP and call a function named wp_footer. If you've ever worked with JavaScript before, you know that a lot of times you don't want to load JavaScript files up in the head section. Instead, you want to load them right before the closing body tag. So this is just our way of giving WordPress the final say before we close out the body tag. So WordPress can use this for all sorts of things like loading JavaScript files, or in this case for adding the black admin menu bar up at the top of the page. Okay, so with this in place, if we save this file and refresh, awesome, there's the admin bar. And that's actually going to bring this lesson to a close. At this point in the course, you might be thinking to yourself, hey, when is the website going to start looking like it was built in the last decade? Because right now, this plain white background and the text and the full width of it, it looks like it was built in 1995. Well, in our very next lesson, we will address the visual or graphic design of our theme. Let's keep our progress rolling, and I will see you then.